Finally today, for crop producers, the time to be vigilant is now. The recent emergence of the Japanese beetle and grasshoppers will prompt many to aggressively scout their fields and determine what treatment, if any, is necessary. Market Journal's Bill Dodd spoke with Extension educator Bob Wright to get his advice on scouting and treating these potentially destructive pests.
As crops begin to mature, familiar foes begin to emerge. While the Japanese beetle was first identified in counties along the eastern portions of Nebraska, the species has increased its distribution throughout the state, being identified as far west as Scottsbluff County last year. While the spread is far-reaching, it doesn't mean every field has been infested. However, for those that have, there are some factors to take into consideration.
Well, sometimes they start off on field borders, and so that may be where you'll see them first. In corn, they'll feed on the leaves, but once, and that's not an economic problem, leaf feeding, but once the ears emerge and silks emerge, that's where the Japanese beetles will prefer to feed. And they're rather large beetles, and you can get 4 or 5 beetles on an ear, and that can totally consume all the silks, and so that can interfere with pollination. The problem is typically we don't have uniform infestations across a field. As I said, oftentimes they're more common on the field borders. So it's a real judgment call whether to treat the whole field when you're only having damage on the field border. On soybeans, they feed on the leaves. They tend to feed on the upper part of the canopy, so the damage is very visible. But we have other insects that are feeding on leaves in soybeans at this time also. So we want to take into account all the leaf injury, and we have thresholds in vegetative stage soybeans. If 30% of the whole leaf area of the plant is lost from insect feeding, that's a treatable level. And we are starting to get into reproductive soybeans in some areas, and the threshold drops down to 20% on reproductive stage soybeans.
One thing to keep in mind while scouting your field, there is another less concerning pest that can be misidentified as the Japanese beetle, which is the sandchafer. The similarities in these two arthropods are striking. However, there are key differences to correctly identify each pest.
Big difference is the sandchafer doesn't feed much as an adult beetle, whereas the Japanese beetle does feed a lot. So the sandchafer is not an economic pest in the adult stage. It's about the same size as the Japanese beetle. It can vary a lot from light tan to almost dark black, the sandchafer. Japanese beetles have a metallic green head and thorax, and then they also have white tufts of hair down the side of the abdomen that the sandchafer doesn't have. So if you know what you're looking for, there's some differences.
Timing will always be a key factor when treating your fields for pests, and the Japanese beetle is no exception. Adult emergence will be underway for the next couple of weeks, and it's very important not to jump the gun and treat too early, as another wave of adults could return.
New adults are going to be emerging for about a 3-week period, and so if you spray too early, you may have new adults coming in later. There's a variety of different insecticides that are effective against Japanese beetles. The issue, as I said, is sometimes they move from field to field and we have new beetles emerge. And so you need to continue to monitor fields. There are a variety of pyrethroid and organophosphate insecticides that are active against Japanese beetles. I guess the other thing in soybeans, you probably also want to be aware of what other insects are present in terms of insecticide selection as well.
And speaking of being aware of what other insects may be present, immature grasshoppers have recently been reported in areas around crop fields in multiple locations around Nebraska. While there are a number of species in Nebraska, there are only 4 that should be of concern to crop producers. Those are the 2-striped, red-legged, differential, and migratory grasshoppers. There is an urgency involved in scouting out and treating these species before an infestation occurs in your fields, as populations are much easier to control around the borders during the immature stages of development.
But if you have more than 40 grasshoppers per square yard in a field border, that would be a threshold that you want to be worried about. The other thing to think about is in some areas uh, depending on how much rain we've had this year, the grasshoppers will stay in the field borders until they start drying out or unless you mow them. So in some areas where we don't have as much, the field borders maybe are drying out, grasshoppers may move into the fields more quickly, or if you mow, they'll move into the fields more quickly. So those are things to think about. In terms of control measures, you need to choose something that's registered for the site you're treating. If you're just treating the field borders and not the crops, there's a wider variety of insecticides you can use. If you are both treating the field borders and the crop, you need to choose an insecticide that's labeled for both of those sites. Then there's several different pyrethroids that can be used that have both labels for use on field borders as well as crops. A couple of trade names are Mustang, Warrior, and Asana. They're not labeled on all sites, so you need to check the label to be sure.
All in all, now is the time to be vigilant in the fields and begin thinking of a strategy to effectively treat and prevent any collateral damage these pests may cause. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.